Alright, without further ado, I would like to introduce the first Relatability filming team.
When the media focuses the idea on what it means to be queer is what it means is to come out, we think we centre the queer movement on the idea that one should bow and scrape for straight people to accept them. We think we shift the idea that to be a queer person, you must come out. We think that is deplorable. We think that is reprehensible. We thoroughly regret that. I have 3 things in today's speech. Firstly, why coming out is inherently negative. Secondly, how the idea that we should be focusing on coming out shifts the queer rights movement into a counterproductive space. And thirdly, how this focus in the media on coming out is directly harmful towards individuals emotionally and physically. Okay, so moving on to my first point. Why coming out is inherently negative. I'm going to outline a best case and a worst case. Note that you're probably somewhere in between. The best case is that I go to my mother and I say, "Mother, I'm other." What you have to do is that you have to go up to, this is an irrefutable fact that in the message of coming out, you have to go up to, a member of your family who should unconditionally love you, and then say, "Hey, I'm different. I'm other. Please accept me." We think that's disgusting. We think there isn't a world in which you should ever have to, go up to someone and do that. We think that is, degrading. But we also think this reinforces a perception that queer people are different, are other. And we think that is incredibly harmful in today's debate, right? What is the message we want to be sending? What's the message that should be in queer media? It should be, gay people exist, cool, they're the same as us. Meh. What we shouldn't have is we shouldn't have the media constantly reminding you that you are different and you're separate. What does this now look like in, the worst case scenario? Notice that in any case, you're always going to be stressed. Why? Because you always have stories in the media which look like the longest night, where you get kicked out of your family, your family kick you out and they'll never accept you again. Always the bad case scenarios exist. So we think that in any case, you're stressed and worried you won't be accepted. And in the worst case scenario, what do you get to see? You get to see kids who are just like you getting abused by their families. We don't think that's the message that should be getting pushed, ever. What we think it does is that it tacitly reinforces that behavior, just like in society. When you constantly see this expression of homophobia and queerphobia, we think that coming out movies are really bad surrounding this. We think this builds on the idea of Hollywood's incentives. How does Hollywood sell a movie? It's dramatic, it's exciting. What does that mean? There's action. When the whole movie is focused and the center of that movie is coming out, I think we can probably reasonably safely fiat in that there are going to be a lot of movies where when you come out, you're going to get, abused, harassed, and not accepted by your family. Why is that such a terrible thing? Because for anyone who, what we're now doing is, we're focusing on a moment that we think is inherently negative. On the best case, you're saying, "I'm different." In the worst case, you're getting, your family abandoning you. We don't support that in any world, right? What's the counterfactual? The counterfactual is, instead of focusing on this incredibly traumatic moment, we're into just having movies where queer people exist. And what this does, I'll move on to this later, but we think it's just really important that we just have this idea of, that you can be queer without having to focus on this idea that you must come out. So secondly, how does this change the focus of queer rights movement? Notably, as I've already gone over, it focuses queerness on this idea that you have to be accepted, right? You've got to come out and you've got to say, "I'm a queer person, please accept me." It's not what you won't be getting a huge lot of in media when you're focusing on this is that you won't get the idea of that you're just a queer person existing. We think that's incredibly harmful towards any gay person who's just watching media. Why? Because they'll never see we don't think they'll be seeing enough media which is just saying, "Hey, you exist in society. You're a part of society." They feel excluded and unwanted. Why does that exist? Because the only media they'll be seeing is this sort of agitated, violent media which has them coming out and then getting abused. We think that's absolutely terrible. We also like to note that not only does it reinforce otherness, which we think is reprehensible, it also wastes political capital. Every single time you're having a protest in a major city that's saying, "We're here, we're queer," That it's not like money and political capital that should be going towards like letting gay Americans be able to adopt kids. We think that's infinitely more important, and we think that's the things that we should be focusing on. Instead of saying we're here, we're here, we're here, we're queer, we should be saying we are here, we want some bloody rights, right? We think that's far more important. We think this focus also shifts. I'll take that in a second. We also think this focus shifts things away from like old queer people. Right? To use the colloquial expression, old gays, we think they exist in society. We think they're incredibly important. We think we want media telling their stories so they can watch a movie and they can see themselves represented in the media. We think that's vitally important, just so anyone gets represented in films and shows. But once we're focusing just on the small select group of a 17-year-old person coming out, they get neglected, they get ignored. The harms are not only that like old queer people don't see themselves reflected in the media. Young queer people don't get to see old queer people in the media as well. They don't get to be able to say, like, you know, I'm going to grow up and live a perfectly normal life. Instead, they're seeing, like, this violent, antagonistic sort of media, which has them, you know, with all of these negative consequences, all of this bad stuff happening in the movies. I'll take your POI now.
The lived experiences of queer people aren't identical to the lived experiences of straight people. Isn't it disingenuous to portray them as the same?
If your idea is that we should be spreading a constant message of otherness and that they're different, we think that's terrible. We think that the only reason that this lived experience exists is because you're perpetuating this narrative of otherness. What exists on our side of the house is we say no. We constantly send the message that there is no difference between a queer person and no difference between a straight person. And we think that is a far more powerful and impactful way of actually sending like affirmation towards like queer acceptance. What's this now look like? It looks like if I am the like average 15-year-old boy who's going to watch a movie. There is, like, let's say I'm a straight 15-year-old boy and I'm going to go watch a movie. Like, there is very little chance that I'm going to watch a movie that's about a gay kid coming out. Right? So what we think that does is that the only, like, when all queer media is about this idea of coming out, it, like, puts it in a box that doesn't then get engaged with by the wider proportion of society. We think that's incredibly important, right? We want to normalize being, like, gay and being queer in society. What does that now mean? We need to have media that actually says that. We need to have media that shows it. If we're all, like, it's all about coming out, it won't appeal to a larger majority of the audience, and we think that's a harm because you're just not getting exposure. This now leads me onto my second point, which is like the emotional harm and the emotional and the safety that you have. What does this look like? Would firstly like to note, though, that once you have all of your media centered on this idea of coming out, what is the problem here? To be gay, you have to come out. Like, if that is the center of all of your media, that you have to do this, right? We think that it now creates an incredibly dangerous internal tension with you, right? What does this look like? It looks like if you want to feel like you're a real gay person, you have to have came out. You have to have, like, done this incredibly, like, which is tragic, but a dangerous step, and we think that is very harmful. What does this look like in terms of safety, right? To use the sad example of Wellington College, it is a homophobic school. What does this now actually practically look like? If I'm a young queer person who has spent my time watching shows, and like the whole point of queer media is that I come out, and I feel like to be a queer person, I have to have came out. What does this now mean for me? It means that I now have an internal tension, which is that either I can do the right thing and come out in Wellington College, and I will be abused, and I will be harassed, and I will not feel safe in that school, or I am not, like, living up to the idea of what a queer person should be, or the message and the narrative that is constantly stressed in media. What is the result? Once we focus on coming out, we stress a dangerous part of someone's life, of a queer person's life. We think it's not the part of their lives we should be focusing on. We think we should treat a queer person's life just like any other, because at the end of the day, they are the same. We should be focusing on their celebrations. We should be focusing on when they, like, are in a movie and they defeat the bad guy, not when they come out. We should be focusing on them living and not being other. That is why we are proud to affirm. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech and would like to invite up the first speaker of the engagement team.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Coming out is about unapologetically being yourself. It's not just about others accepting you, because it's obvious in a society of Donald Trumps and other bigoted figures that not everyone's going to accept you. I think that's what the other team seems to be like misrepresenting. Okay, I'm going to quickly go on to some rebuttal, context and framing, and then we're going to go on to our two main points about how this is like these coming out stories are emotionally significant to LGBTQ audiences and how it has positive interactions with straight audiences. Okay, moving on to some rebuttal. Like, they mentioned how like movies that portray homophobia and transphobia are like harmful to people watching the movie. And look, I think that movies that portray it condemn these things, right? They condemn these bullies as being dehumanizing, as like horrible people that nobody wants to be. I think that's pretty obvious. And like on the point about just like what Clara kind of flagged to you in a POI. Look, I go to an all-boys school. I'm sure he talked about Wellington College for example. I know for a fact that there is entrenched homophobia and transphobia in society. Again, as flagged by Clara, most LGBTQ people don't live like normal lives in the sense of experiences. They experience transphobia, they experience harassment, discrimination, and bullying. Heck, gay marriage was legalized in Australia in 2017, and trans people still have lots of barriers to accessing the correct affirmation care and just like other things to do with that. So I think they've really misrepresented like the experiences of LGBTQ people. But even, and I'll go over this a bit later, but like the LGBTQ people it's a very intersectional community, but the one thing that brings them all together is the fact that in a variety of, on a spectrum, they've all had to come out at some point. They've all had to accept who they are as a person and accept that reality. And I think that's one thing that we can do, and that is, unite the LGBTQ community on this experience. Okay, now going on to some context and framing. What does this focus look like? And well, coming out is the main, firstly, coming out is the main, emotional beat in the plot. This could look like a movie all about coming out, or a character arc that where that is the moment of catharsis for them. Secondly, a focus on coming out necessitates the reason why someone would be in the closet in the first place. You have to build up the stakes, the emotional stakes for the audience. This looks like, struggling to find a label for yourself. You live in a homophobic religious community. You're unaware whether your parents will support you, etc. So what does the counterfactual look like? I think they basically agree with that counterfactual. LGBTQ media and popular culture primarily portrays characters who have already come out and there isn't a major story beat, and they normally they portray them as normal, and I don't really have to go over the reasons why this is true because they agree with this. Okay, why is this important? Well, the counterfactual isn't a deeply nuanced portrayal of queer issues, because there are lots of subtle things that are just misrepresented or just not represented at all. That the majority of the audience, which are straight, need to become aware of, especially in a society where these issues are still very prevalent. So these stories probably just depict LGBTQ characters maybe they mention briefly, oh look, I'm gay, I have a boyfriend, or etc. But it isn't really a key moment to the plot, and it doesn't really help us get entranced in the story. Okay, I'll take a POI quickly before I move on to my points.
Is coming out the most important part of a queer person's life?
It is a part, the part of a queer person life that all queer people can in some way relate to. I don't think it's the most important part. It is one of the most important parts, I would say. Accepting yourself unapologetically and coming out to the world as who you really are. Okay, on to the first point about how coming out stories are emotionally significant to LGBTQ audiences. No matter how liberal your parents are or how progressive your community is, coming out is still a super vulnerable moment for individuals because it's high stakes. There's a lot of what ifs. What if my parents don't accept me? What if my school doesn't accept me? What if all these other factors that I'll talk about more in depth, lots of what ifs. It's really a vulnerable moment for this individuals. This means we're seeing a lot in coming out stories is that often, or this means that seeing these coming out stories in media is reassuring that eventually things will turn out to be okay, even if you have these factors transphobia, homophobia, discrimination, etc. But B, it shows you that it's okay to be anxious because other people have experienced this. This is super important. I'll talk about this, more out when it comes to the outcomes. Secondly, coming out stories are uniquely unable to push the realities of your experiences under the rug. They have to have it. It's part of the essential plot device of the narrative. The comparative where gay characters are portrayed exactly like straight characters is honestly disingenuous. Your ability to relate to this piece of media, to your experiences in a homophobic society, and like a society of homophobia and transphobia, just decreases. You have less enjoyment. Thirdly, coming out is an experience, as I flagged you before, that all people in the queer community can relate to on some spectrum. This helps build empathy and connection within the queer community, especially because people have different opinions. It's an intersectional community. They don't all think the same thing. Because again, not everybody sees experiences with gender and sexuality as being analogous. But this is where they converge. This is where everyone can relate and come together as a community. Okay, what are the outcomes of this? Well, mainly just the emotional catharsis that coming out provides is just greater on our side of the world. That's particularly important because being LGBTQ can be an isolating experience, and it's good to be able to relate to this kind of media. This sounds low impact for maybe someone like me who's straight cis. But the ability for someone to and see themselves portrayed adequately in the media is so important, especially for your mental health, and especially considering it's one of the most anxiety-inducing things you can do. Adequate representation is really strong for our case. Okay, moving on to point 2, which is how these stories interact with straight audiences. Context. The largest portion of the audiences for these films are just cis-het people just like me. Why is this true? Well, for a piece of media to be successful and popular culture, it has to have a broad appeal. It's in the name, popular culture, okay? Secondly, this is just to mention this here, this is often the main way that people who don't really have a lot of interactions or knowledge of what coming out was interact with the LGBTQ community and otherwise wouldn't seek out this information. Okay, going on to some mechanism. Firstly, portraying how difficult it is to coming out puts pressure on cis-het people to react very empathetically to people in their life when they come out, because they know and realize how high stakes it is for them and how uncomfortable they've been. On the comparative, this looks like a 15-year-old, in their world, it looks like a 15-year-old girl who's been crying every night to come to reality, maybe with her gender, and coming up to her friends, and her friends just brush it off because that experience is normal, right? It's been normalized within media. It definitely is not. It sounds emotional and exaggerated, but that is the world that they're advocating for, where this unique experience to LGBTQ people is normalized. And on the second mechanism, these stories have characters which act as barriers. Again, I've mentioned that in my framing, and it can help people recognize when they might be a barrier, subconsciously or consciously, to people in their lives coming out. And thirdly, these sorts of narratives help people to understand, that although gay marriage is allowed, it doesn't mean everything is fair and equal. Again, I've mentioned to you many times throughout the debate where this isn't the case. Outcome, cis-het people are just better equipped in their interactions with LGBTQ people and are more empathetic and nice to them and their stories of coming out. Thank you. Proud to negate.
I thank you for that speech, and I would like to invite on the second speaker of the affirming team.
Yeah, you were right about the flattering angles thing.
Yeah.
We would rather a queer person faces disparity when they tell people they're getting married to another woman later in life than feel as though it's a necessary rite of passage to put themselves in danger at age 15 when they see Heartstopper for the first time and feel like that's the only way they can be a real lesbian, right? We would rather they face that homophobia and that disparity later in life when they are less isolated, less vulnerable, less at the dispense of their parents who could kick them out or physically abuse them for being gay, because that is a real thing that happens in countries where gay marriage is legalized, in countries where there's, a large gay community, where there's a large queer community. So even when you have queer representation like they argue for, you still have kids living in unsafe households that feel left out, that feel like they have to do this in order to be accepted by their community, and that put themselves in danger. We can never stand for that. We think that these kids are already feeling confused and worried without the added pressure of feeling like they need to tell their parents at this very second. We think that these kids are already feeling isolated from their peers at school. We think that the focus should be on the queer joy that you get later in life when you marry the love of your life, the same as any straight person, rather than being about probably one of the most anxiety-ridden days of your life. Okay, two things in this speech. Firstly, on the narrative within the queer community, and then secondly, on how that flows out into wider world impacts. So firstly, on narrative, what does focusing on coming out do for the narrative surrounding trans and queer people and their experiences? Firstly, I'm going to talk about the queer community and queer rights movement's narrative internally, because I think that that's what creates the change in the outside world. I don't think that the average straight 30-year-old man is going to see a film about coming out. Okay, firstly, on the internal narrative then, we give you this line at our first speech about how the queer rights movement has historically prioritized acceptance rather than normalcy. And that looks like prioritizing having a pride parade over, talking about how gay people can be in a nuclear family too, right? It's about being out and proud. It's about being here and queer. And while we think that that's very well and good and very important to a lot of queer people, it is not the most beneficial thing for queer rights. And we are not at a point in society yet where we can stop thinking about the fundamental rights that gay men in the USA still do not have to adopt their own child, right? We think that the narrative of acceptance that has come from this, that the focusing of coming out in the media has been a factor into, that this narrative of acceptance rather than normalcy, like what Nicole told you about being other, about having to come out and admit some sin, even though you're just the same as everyone else, right? About how that is backsliding, how that prevents progress, how that has prevented the very things that get trans kids hormones and that get gay men adoption rights, right? So we think that it's better for normalcy to be the main aim of the gay rights movement. That means that we do support films that are just about people later in life, living their lives, getting married, getting stood up at the altar, being chased after at the airport, seeing if they look behind them. We would rather that was the narrative. We would rather that the media pushed that idea of gay people are the same as everyone else, rather than this norm of the heartstopper narrative of oh, mum, I'm gay, do you support me? And either she says yes, and then kids think that their mum's going to say yes and that their mum's going to support them, and kids put themselves in danger, or she says no, and you're reminding every kid of the fact that they're never going to be supported for their family for something they can't control, right? So either way, in that case, you get these bad impacts. So that's on the narrative within the queer movement, right? And we hear this line, note that this responds to the material from First Negative, because they talk about how the lived experiences of queer people are different, and we shouldn't just be shoving them into the same box as straight people. But note that we think they're different in two ways. The first is just who these people love, and the second is the level of backlash that they receive because of who they love, right? They want to focus on the second thing, which is the hardest day in someone's life when they tell their parents that they're gay and they get kicked out, right? That's what they want to focus on. We don't think that's productive for queer rights, but we also don't think it's productive for the emotional burden that puts on your young viewers who are now watching this play out and thinking that could be me, right? So let's look at Neg's case about how representation needs to show the hard parts of life, the homophobia, right? What is the result of this specific representation that they posit? We think the unique thing about what they need to stand for, which is the focusing on of coming out, it's a real mouthful, is the notion that portraying coming out as the most important and most relevant part of the queer experience is the best form of representation. Because queer media is queer advocacy insofar as people don't fully accept queer people, right? So queer media and whatever you focus on in it becomes a part of your movement, becomes a part of your advocacy. Therefore, it's really important that representation is accurate and that it is the most effective if someone were to see it, right? So there are lots of ways you can represent queer people. We give to you at our first speech how we think that you should be focusing on the parts of a queer person's life that are the same as straight people's, because that's how you get support from wider society. That's how you get people to realize, maybe it's okay if two gay men have kids together, if I don't have to, if they don't shove it in my face, right? Like, this is the thing with coming out. This is the problem that straight people have with it, is that they have an aversion to what they think is abnormal. They have an aversion to what they think is not right. But when we prioritize normalcy over like acceptance and coming out and being loud and proud, that's when we get the really, really impactful benefits that we've been talking about. So what we want to prioritize in media is like that universal human experience part that queer people do still experience. I'm going to bring you back to what I was saying about what it means to be queer, what's different. It's firstly who you love, it's secondly the backlash. We don't think you should focus on the backlash. We think you should focus on the stories that we grant to straight people, on the complex characters whose whole life is not just about the day they told their school, is not just about the day they told their parents. We don't want queer media to be about the scariest day of your life. We don't want it to be about when you get identity catharsis. We think you can get that identity catharsis on your wedding day, and you can show that to people as well without focusing on the 15-year-old who was banished from their church because they felt like they had to come out, right? We want to grant people these complex stories. We think that is diminishing to the queer experience to say the most relevant part of your queerness and the most important day of your life is your coming out. Or even just the most important part of your coming of age, right? Like, yes, it's a really important part of teenagehood that you explore your sexuality and you understand your identity, but it's also important that you get the same stories that straight kids do, right? It's important that you see yourself, at the prom on the TV rather than crying to your girlfriend who's telling you that she has to break up with you because you can't tell your parents, right? That's the queer representation of coming out we get. We don't support that. We think that it's not productive. Yes, there might be an emotional moment in one of these films that we're talking about where someone does come out or where someone overcomes some homophobia, right? We don't think that should be the focus. We don't have to stand for never showcasing homophobia on TV, but what we're standing for is not telling kids that the only way to be a real queer person is to come out to everyone regardless of how unsafe that might make you, right? It's this focus on coming out in the media, and notably media, again, is really important to the queer rights movement because it's one of the only public ways that you can show your support for something. It's one of the only public ways that you can show that you're making progress as a society, right? And the focus on coming out is one way that the LGBT advocacy movement has prevented its own progress because it hasn't helped those most in need, right? It forces that kid in an unsupported Christian household to sit in the corner watching her friends at the Pride Parade and wondering why she can't be like that, wondering if she's really gay, wondering if she's done enough to show her sexuality to the world.
That is the people. The speech of like White House exactly details and negation thing.
Oh god, that angle. The earliest queer stories on TV were coming out stories. You don't get to the point where you show people, gay people living normal lives without first forcing people to reckon with the prejudices that stop queer people from living normal lives. 3 things to do in my speech. Firstly, kind of some framing it around whether or not it's a good thing for people to come out. Do they want to come out, and would they want to without this narrative on TV, right? Secondly, on the emotional experience for queer people themselves, and then lastly on the ways in which they interact with the wider world and kind of goals of the queer movement. Okay, firstly then, on do people want to come out? We hear from F that coming out is an inherently negative thing, that you shouldn't have to come out, right? And that queer people don't owe that to the world. Look, I agree with this, right? But that doesn't mean that queer people don't want to come out, right? It's emotionally empowering to claim an identity as part of a marginalized group. I think that's pretty obvious, right? But also, and note that this is like a substantive contribution, some people have to come out. If you're a trans kid who needs like parental permission to access hormones, you literally have to come out. You can't just like start living your normal, authentic life without first coming out, as awful as that might be. That means that it's important for this experience to be portrayed, right? I think the second thing to note here is that they want you to believe that coming out stories on TV are going to create a really, really strong pressure to come out, and people are going to come out in situations where this is adverse to them to do so, or like I guess at a lower degree, people are going to feel bad if they don't think they can come out. I think firstly, people are still able to do cost-benefit analysis, right? If your family is incredibly homophobic, hell, if they watch the coming out story on TV and they're like, being gay is a sin, I think you probably know it isn't safe for you to come out. But what is uniquely different, and this is also building on our case at first, this is new, is that people who will be in the closet for a long time, who feel unsafe, these narratives are particularly important for them. Why? Because they bridge the gap of being closeted and unable to live your authentic life to the one where you can. Because these characters uniquely inhabit both worlds, instead of the characters you only see on TV being ones who are nothing like you, who never experience the same thing as you, because they are just out and proud and living a happy life that you think you can't access. That's a massive harm under F's world. I have no idea how they're going to justify it to you. The second thing that I want to note here is that they tell you that at first that the worst case is Hollywood just portrays these things as like abuse narratives over and over again. Firstly, these things are obviously going to be condemned, right? In these cases, the queer characters are the protagonists. I think the abuse is pretty comprehensively condemned, and it's probably a really good thing. But I think, secondly, it's by their own analysis of like not wanting queer people to come out in dangerous situations, it is better that there are things that portray to them accurately that coming out can be dangerous, that it isn't always good, that you have to think a lot about it, right? And the comparative is for really, really young people, if they only see stories where queer people are living their authentic lives, you're like 13, you watch Heartstopper, you don't understand that your mom's not going to accept you, you come out and you do put yourself in danger. There's a risk F uniquely takes, right? I think at the end of that, what you should believe is, firstly, it is often good for people to come out, or at least think that it is possible for their lives. But in situations where it isn't, coming out stories are uniquely important because it equips people to deal with that reality emotionally and just like practically, right? I think secondly then, and more broadly on the experience of queer people, but I'll take a POI before that.
When a young closeted person sees 5 films where the protagonist in the climax is the person comes out, do they feel like they're truly a part of the queer community if they don't do that?
Sure, I think that the person who is coming out is still a part of the queer community before they come out, right? They probably have queer friends. They probably engage with queer content like tacitly online or whatever. I don't think people have ever genuinely thought that just because I'm not out, I'm not part of this community. And I think uniquely, queer people have a lot of empathy. This community has a lot of empathy for people who are in the closet. Why? Because they engage with those stories about how difficult that is to be. That only happens when coming out stories are the focus of this media. Let's talk then more broadly about the emotional experiences of queer people. I think it's just extremely important that you also validate that this is a hard thing to be, right? It is not emotionally valuable for you to only see queer people living a normal life when that is nothing like what you experience, right? When you go to school every day and hear people calling people gay in the changing room as an insult, it probably doesn't make you feel super great when you never access media that you can relate to that. I agree with F. A queer love story is the same as a straight love story. You can relate at least to an extent with the straight love stories you see on TV. What is exclusive is the ability to relate to coming out narratives. So it's the only things that are fundamentally extremely different, and they only exist underneath. I think the most important piece of material that we hear from them that could bring back some ground here is at least straight people are going to engage with coming out stories than they would do with just gay people and the media in general. But I think two things to note here. Firstly, gay stories about coming out can still become a cultural phenomenon, right? They want to use the example of Heartstopper. Way more of my straight friends have watched Heartstopper and are all like sad about Charlie Spring coming out than my gay friends, right? But gay people often don't even like these narratives particularly much, but they often appeal uniquely to straight people because it's something quite different for straight people, but it's also emotionally easy to access. As a straight person, maybe you don't access the nuances of like the everyday experience of being misgendered. You probably do kind of understand on an intuitive level how bad it is to repress your entire identity. Those are experiences that are accessible to straight people and that do make a change. I think the last thing to note here is that in either world, the most homophobic people don't engage with this media. So the difference then is that the average person in the status quo doesn't think that gay people are aliens or so unlike them, but what they can't understand is how difficult those experiences can be. That's what's elucidated to them through coming out stories. Lastly then, this leads me into my material on the focus of the queer rights movement. We hear from us that you should just exist in society and just waste the political capital of the gay movement, that we should be focusing more on like gay adoption than like stories of coming out. I don't think that we would ever get to a point where gay male couples are able to adopt without first forcing people to reckon with how bad homophobia is, what a pervasive force that is. These stories are uniquely able to do that, right? We tell you at first that these stories confront cishet people with the reality of what they do, right? Because when these characters are the protagonists and their lives are being made difficult by the cishet people around them who like have prejudices, do things that make them not want to come out, you as a cishet person watching this see this person as the villain, as the antagonist, and that makes you confront the way that you do that in your own life. That doesn't exist in like actual life because you don't see people as protagonist-antagonist dichotomy. But I think specifically it makes people's coming out experiences easier because it demonstrates how you are supposed to act when people come out. That's what we tell you at SAM. That's super important. You don't just brush it off. You try to offer someone as much support as possible. You recognize what a difficult experience that has been for them. Maybe that's the difference between being like, oh cool, you're trans, whatever, and like, wow, thank you so much for telling me. How can I support you? Like, can I help you come out to your parents? Can we help you get counseling, hormones, whatever? I think that's a massive exclusive benefit, right? Lastly, I think they tell you about homophobia on TV will exist on either world, and that's how we get the change. But there is no incentive for straight people to portray this without an emotional payoff. That emotional payoff only exists through these coming out stories. We tell you at SAM that these stories are mostly approved by straight executives. That means that coming out stories are the only way we're going to get those accurate, genuine depictions of homophobia on screen that do change the social narrative, that do change the Overton window on what is acceptable to discuss. That's how we get social change.
I thank the speaker for their speech and would like to invite up the third speaker to the podium today.
I wrote that exact same intro. Oh my god, we're so in tune. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We don't think it's fair to suggest that queer people need to be equipped to deal with the hard truth when we think that actually queer people deal with that hard truth in their everyday lives every single day. In the world, you will see your people struggle so long as they continue to struggle, right? We know that mainstream media always wants to focus on the bad because it seems the most important, it seems the most big, it's going to get the most clicks. So we think that you're always going to see minorities struggle and queer people struggle in the media, right? We don't actually think that changes on either side. Uniquely, on our side, when you see people like you on film being happy and living a fulfilling life, you know that that is something that is possible for you, no matter the outcome that you are, no matter the life you are living right now, no matter the struggles you are facing. 3 questions for you today. Firstly, on the effects of queer people. Secondly, on the effects on straight people. And then thirdly, on the effects of progress, because again, this is like a regrets mood, and I think it's important we keep bringing that up. So to start with the effects on queer people, I think it's really important to bring up, Neg has came out and basically set up this whole idea of emotional significance, and that's why it's so important that queer people have these like queer things that show coming out as being a part of being yourself. It's being who you are, and now you're able to see this, so you're able to be queer and be proud. They then, at second, completely contradict this by saying, no queer people I know actually watch Heartstopper, one of the most mainstream queer medias of today, right? So what we're hearing here is, A, if this is true, there actually is no emotional significance. But saying that actually that was a slip up, that gay people do watch Heartstopper, if we're taking on them on that, right? We've actually told you from the start that the narrative of coming out being a huge, important part of the life of a queer people, and particularly the part that is most represented on television, is really harmful because it is the most negative part of a queer person's life, right? It is, especially for young people, which we think a lot of these films portray young people, it is the part where you are, like they've stated, the most vulnerable, the most likely to be kicked out of your house, to have your entire environment change just for saying, this is who I am and this is who I want to be, right? And so we think that that's actually harmful on queer people. We think that when, like we've told you, that there's going to be these emotional harms on individuals here, right? To be gay, you feel like you have to come out. To be trans, you feel like you have to tell your parents once you know, right? And that is always going to be harmful because there is always the chance that you're going to be kicked out. We think instead, when you're showing the entire lifespan of a queer person living their authentic life, this instead, you don't feel like the most important part of being queer is coming out to your parents as soon as you can, otherwise you're not a true queer person. You can then wait, you can then say, okay, I've moved out, I'm independent, and now if I want to, I can talk to my family, but I also don't need to. That's not the most integral part of being queer, right? We think it is kind of ridiculous to say that the most integral part of being queer is telling straight people about it, right? We think that if an experience is based on who you love, the most important part of that experience is loving, right? And so what we think we see here from there is we think the emotional significance that they're talking about here isn't like looking like, oh, all people, queer people can relate, and they're like, oh, now people understand that like, oh, we should come out, that'll be good, and that's an important part of our lives. A, we think it's bad to tell you that it's an important part of our lives, right? Because of what we've told you here. And B, we think that that is only putting people in harm's way, and we think that is always going to be harmful. And when you think that the comparative there is always going to be showing other aspects of queer lives, right? So what we're hearing here is that the narrative right now is promoting harmful, sad queer moments, when actually the rest of a queer life can be absolutely happy, can be positive. And so what we see here is queer people on our side feel like they can love life, feel like it's more than just your dad kicking you out at 15 because he holds conservative views and doesn't believe you should be able to live your life. And so we also see that you believe that you are you are a queer person even before you come out, because that's not what's integral to your community, and so you're not putting yourself in danger. Now, secondly, on the effects of straight people, so the negative side has kind of come out and told you this idea on straight audiences, right? They've told you, A, queer people is mainly to appeal to straight audiences. Firstly, I'm just going to debunk why this is uniquely not true when it's a story that's about coming out, right? Coming out, like we all agree, is right now a uniquely queer experience. Straight people don't have to come out to their parents, right? And so, the reason people watch films and watch media is because they relate to it in some way or find it engaging in some way. Straight people, the average straight person who doesn't have that much time to watch every movie in the world, is not going to see the story where the climax says, Mum, Dad, I'm gay, as something that is either relatable or engaging to them. So we don't actually think it's fair to say that straight audiences are the most important there. We think that if straight audiences are the most important there, then again, the whole point on emotional significance is kind of gone out of the way, right? We also think it's definitely not the only way for straight people to see queer lives, and we think that it's really bad if the only way you're portraying queer lives in media is this one negative moment, right? We think that is always going to be harmful to straight people. Now, they've told us that this leads to people being more empathetic, whereas in our world, people brush off that fear. Again, like I've told you from the start, other media, mainstream media, will show those harms, right? We know that harms will always be shown to a minority group. So we actually think that it's not fair to say, oh, they'll just brush off that fear because they don't understand it, because we think we will see that otherwise. And we think that people can accept that being kicked out of your house is typically negative, and therefore someone doing something that could get them kicked out of their house is something brave, right? And so we don't actually think that changes here. What we think actually happens on our side, and why we think this is negative here, is that what we can get on our side is that now, because movies the narratives aren't around queer coming out, they're about queer love, and particularly love, which is something that everyone experiences, right? It is now actually more relatable. It doesn't seem like this is some different thing that I don't really get. It's now like this is intrinsically linked with, oh, I like watching an action movie. It's cool that this guy is saving a guy instead of a girl, right? Because what I care about is the big bombs. It's not the love story on the end. Oh, I love rom-coms. I think it's cool that this journalist is chasing after another girl journalist when she's running through the airport, right? It becomes something that's relatable because it means that the focus is now about another genre. It's not about coming out. It's about something different in our lives. And I think it's really important that for queer people, you can actually see my life is not about coming out and proving to other people that I am queer. My life can be about so many different things. Queer people have different incentives, and queer people are allowed to have different incentives. A queer person's incentive can be getting that big article through, right? A queer person's incentive can be fighting the bad guy, and we think that that's really important that we show that those incentives exist, right? So, and then thirdly, onto this effect on progress, right? Basically, the negative team has come out and told us that, oh, we couldn't have progress without accepting that gay people live hard lives. Like I've told you throughout my speech, you are always going to see gay people living hard lives in the same way that you see any minorities live hard lives. What we think changes here is that we are now able to see that gay people can live good lives, and we can also see that coming out and proving that you can be a queer person is not the most important part of being queer. And so we can now use this political capital to instead focus on getting these other issues through, right? We don't actually think it's fair to say that straight people will only ever engage with queer people if they watch Heartstopper, and even if it is, we don't think that proves anything for the negative side. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for their speech. And now to close out the substantial portion of today's debate, I invite up the third speaker to the
Look, whilst I think a big part of no one's life is feeling like you have to justify yourself to everyone around you and feeling like you need to spend all of your time rationalizing to other people why who you are is okay, I feel like a big part simultaneously of anyone's life, right, is feeling like you can talk to your friends and have them relate to your experiences, have them be able to, you know, give you support without nodding off what you're feeling because they think it's normal or easy. Right, so two things to do in my speech mainly. Firstly, around how straight people are motivated and therefore then, right, put into action in areas of queer people's life. And then secondly, and more importantly, around how queer people are affected. So firstly, on how straight people are motivated, right? What do we tell you in our world about this? We tell you about how acceptance is exemplified, right? As these people gain a new, unique perspective, right? We also tell you that straight people uniquely have no perspective on coming out without this media, right? We give you lots of good analysis as to why this is true, right? Because largely thinking that, you know, being queer is normal is a thing that you can achieve through just meeting these people in your day-to-day life. Whereas the struggles with both the before and after of coming out are something that is intensely personal. And even when someone does come out to you, they are highly unlikely to share with you all the trials and tribulations and sleepless nights and, you know, antagonists, if you will, that they went through to get to this point, right? What they tell you in their world
around this is really not a lot, which is rather unstrategic, right? The main point here is that most straight people simply don't interact with this media, right? Or at least that they're not like a big part of it, right? And that they're not very important, right? So there are two main responses here, right? Firstly, relating to the experience of coming out is exclusively tied to this media, right? And I want to stress that again, right? Because these things are intimate and personal. We hear no sort of stressing and mechanizing from the affirmative side as to how straight people are going to, learn what it's like to be able to go through the experience of struggling with coming out, right? So what does this mean? This largely means that on the affirmative side, straight people are largely clueless as to what it's like to be going through this experience, right? They're largely clueless as to what it's like to come out, which is, as I'll get to shortly, a very, very significant harm, right? Secondly, these LGBTQ plus media pieces are usually immense cultural phenomena, right? You're thinking things like Heartstopper, right? These things are not really niche at all, right? You go into libraries and they have big stands about these things. They're very widely read. I think it's largely, sort of an assertion to just assume that straight people don't engage with these things. And I think since straight people are a significant majority of the human population, therefore you're going to see a lot of engagement from them, right? And I'm not spending too much time on this clash, right? But I do think it's important. There's just not a lot of content to cover from the affirmative side here, right? So what we see here is, why is this relevant, right? And I feel like because whether it's acceptance or normalization, which is a key point of clash that I get to later on in the debate, I think straight people are a key factor, because on either side, you are having to, vie to the straight people, and because they are generally the world at large, for normalization, for them to think that you are normal, because probably other queer people think you are normal anyway, right? But also acceptance, most queer people are going to accept you anyway, right? Especially with the stuff from Clara that we hear about, acceptance being a big thing in the LGBTQ plus community, right? Therefore, straight people are an immensely significant part of this system, right? And without an understanding from them about queer life, it's difficult. Like, these people cannot relate and provide adequate support to their friends who are, maybe queer and stuff. And again, it's all these examples that we hear from Sam and from Clara about your friends knowing what your experience is like and being able to better give you support and not waving it off anyways and then starting talking about the football match or something, because they understand the significance. I'll take that POI before I continue.
Do you think straight people need to know every step of coming out to understand that it's scary to prove yourself as a minority and therefore have empathy for people different to them?
I think not every step, but largely most of the steps, yes. And I feel like without this narrative, what do straight people really know about this process? They know that their friend comes up to them and says, I've been struggling with this for a wee bit, but I am, X, identity, and, I'd really like to talk to you about it. And they think, oh, that's great, I'll be here for you, or whatever. But they don't understand, as I've said before, all of the process that goes into it. We give you examples, and anecdotes about, teenage girls maybe crying for months on end in the room because they cannot grapple with how to express their identity to people, right? These are things that straight people probably have never even had to think about in their entire lives, right? And without sort of, any kind of media explaining to them that this is how it is, subliminal messaging about, being queer just being normal is probably not going to be enough to get through to them, right? So how queer people are affected is obviously the most important clash in this debate then, I think, right? So in terms of our world, we tell you about individual interactions are improved. And this is along a similar vein of your friends, is supporting you. But largely you're coming out and then you're having positive experiences with people around that, right? You're having positive conversations. These people are embracing you with more open arms because they understand the struggle you're going through, right? We tell you that your identity and your experience are validated by your family, your friends. We tell you that for the many who have to come out, there is a unique benefit here, right? And on AF's world, they talk about how coming out is like inherently bad and demonizing and that it's to be avoided, and they claim that as a benefit. They tell you about the better situation of being headed later in life after you get married to the love of your life rather than getting immediate backlash. And they tell you that, there's a big threat that you'll feel as if you're not a real queer person if you don't come out. Okay, 4 main responses here. Firstly, most queer people, a vast majority, have to come out at some point. This could be for a variety of reasons, right? Obviously, if you want to have a wedding with your family where you get married to a woman, if you are a woman, they obviously are going to know at some point that you are gay. I feel like that is just an inherent point of the process, right? The same thing with hormone replacement therapy for trans people. You can't get HRT if people don't know that you're trans, right? This means two things. Firstly, this means I think the degree of, like, for instance, not feeling like a real lesbian, as the affirmative side has claimed as an example, is further mitigated, right? Because I feel like at the end of the day, you're not going to feel like you're not a real queer person for not coming out if a majority of people are having to come out, right? This is immediately drawn to only maybe like 20% of these people, right? And then secondly, and more importantly, giving these people catharsis is therefore super important because this is such a large swath of the community, right? Secondly, yes, there's points from the affirmative side about how both sides have struggled on their side, right, and display in this media. But I feel like uniquely on our side, we display the struggles that are unique to being queer, right? Whereas in a fantasy movie featuring a queer person on the affirmative side, the main struggle is how the queer person manages to kill the dragon while still being queer. I feel like straight people probably understand the difficulties that comes with killing a dragon. That's not actually that important to their understanding of society. What is important to them is that they understand the struggles of being queer because they don't understand that in their personal lives because they are not queer, right? Thirdly, coming out may not be the crux of queer life, but I feel like it is the most universally applicable and therefore impactful, right? It's something that everyone in the very diverse LGBTQ plus community can relate to because it's something that they all either have to do or grapple with the thought of doing at some point in their lives, right? Fourthly, if you want to mitigate the harms to these people, you have to portray them accurately, right? You need to portray accurately the harms that queer people face in order to get better mobilization around getting rid of them. You need to tell the doctor where it hurts before he can fix it, right? It's pretty simple. So at the end of this, I feel like AF has really not met their analytical burden, right? Because they need to prove that the stuff about coming out pressure, etc., is significantly more harmful than the neglect of your experiences, of people passing them over. I feel like they also have to prove that they can get these narratives around being queer, being normal, without narratives of acceptance, which they simply can't do. Which at the end of this debate, you can frame this very neatly as acceptance versus normalization. And not only is acceptance more important, but you simply cannot have the latter without the former. And that's why I'm very proud to negate. Thank you. I thank the speaker for their speech, and now in a rule invented by our very own John BP, we are going to flip the speaking order. And so I would like to invite up the reply speaker for the negation today.
I have never once watched a coming out movie and felt bad that I haven't told my parents that I'm gay. I have watched a coming out movie and thought, maybe one day that will be me, and maybe that's today. 3 things to do in my speech. Firstly, on is coming out intrinsically bad. Secondly, on what this is like for queer people and their experiences emotionally. And lastly, on straight people and how this might flow on to social change. 2 things to note at the end of the debate on coming out. We tell you that the pressure doesn't exclusively come from movies, right? It's empowering to claim your own identity. But just in most cases, this is a practical necessity, right? You need to get hormones. You want to introduce your parents to your boyfriend. At some point, you literally just have to practically come out unless you plan to live your whole life very, secretly avoiding letting people meet your romantic partner, which I think most people just don't do, right? I think what that means then it is very important to make sure that coming out experiences, which are probably the most universal, are good. So let's talk then about queer people. I want to know firstly on coming out at a young age, AF wants to make you believe that this is going to be very threatening, right? If you make people watch a lot of coming out movies, they're going to come out into an unsafe situation. But I think what is unique about these coming out movies is it warns people who might be naive, who are really young, who would otherwise have a comparative, that is, they just think it's okay, everybody is always going to accept them. That is when they are the most likely to come out into dangerous situations. That harm is uniquely quite likely under AF because they don't realize the stakes. But for the people who are able to realize the stakes, their coming out experiences are going to be engaged with more positively. Like I've told you, most people don't live their whole lives closeted. That means that having an experience when they come out, and when they might come out again and again and again throughout their life, where people validate that, where people facilitate good experiences for them, like getting hormone therapy, like, getting a marriage certificate, whatever, that's really important. But secondly, to literally no response, I tell you second that this bridges the gap. People who live in unsafe situations can see that one day they will be able to live in a safe situation, a happy one. That gives you so much hope. I think that is the most important point of emotional catharsis in the debate. debate far more important than watching somebody like you slay a fantasy dragon. Look, I think you can probably relate to the person who slays a fantasy dragon in a dimension other to their sexuality. That's not the same for coming out stories. Lastly, on invalidation, I think it's far worse when the only stories you saw at the end of the debate were people who are out. That's what's alienating, right? Because the comparative is you see people like you on TV all the time struggling with the same issues that you do, or you just see people living happy lives that feel like nothing like the life that you live. That's when people are alienated. That's when the emotional experience is awful. I think at the end of that, the emotional experiences for queer people are far better underneath. I think that's the thing that is the easiest to prove in this debate and probably the most certain. So I think that's the most important, right? Because it's hard to predict how an entire group of like people who have historically marginalized another group are going to act. But let's talk secondly about straight people. On relatability, I think it's probably relatively assumed by both teams that cishet people interact with queer people in their day-to-day. The average cishet person doesn't think that a queer person is fundamentally unlike them. But it is intuitively hard to understand the exact details of someone's struggle, particularly if those details are never portrayed to you on screen. If what you see on screen is just like, these people are just like me, they don't have any struggles ever, that's when it becomes uniquely unable to understand that those things are hard and know that this is a regrets debate that becomes worse and worse and worse because people just never engage with the fact that those experiences are awful. I think that means, but the comparative is the antagonistic portrayal of this behavior makes you confront your own prejudices, the way that you as a straight person might be actively hurting people in your life that doesn't exist in any other way. But I think lastly, does this flow into social change? Regardless of what you believe about the way that straight people interact with this media, I think the burden on this point is probably just relatively high, right? And the people who engage with this media on either world were likely to not be like raging homophobes. But if people are able to recognize their own prejudices, that is the point at which you're most likely to get them supporting social change.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and now to close us out for the day, I would like to invite up the reply speaker to Birmingham.
Oh, awkward.
What is he missing?
No, it's all good. Found it. Listen, a kid forced into the closet does not have to see a young person on screen coming out to accept themselves. We explain to you down the line that it's better for that closeted kid to see something that's plausible in their future, like living freely or getting married once they're out of their parents' suppressive house. We don't think it's plausible for the negating team to come up at reply and tell us that actually it's really emotionally cathartic to, as a closeted person, see, someone else come out of the closet and think, wow, maybe in another life that's me, right? We think that actually makes you feel like shit. We tell you that down the line, and excuse my language, but it's a really serious emotional feeling that you have when you feel so deeply about something that is so intrinsic to your identity, and yet cannot engage with the media that there is about it because it does not represent you, because it forces you into this box of, okay, I either now have to put myself in danger or I just have to accept that I will never be like these people on the show. I also don't think it's very charitable for negating team to say that coming out includes marriage announcements and adults beginning testosterone without announcing it, right? Because considering getting married and taking hormones is something straight people can do without the thing of coming out, I don't think that's fair. I also think it came out far too late for us to properly respond. But let's talk about what we've said that's been unresponded to. I want to talk about this emotional harm because I think that it's probably the thing that's been talked about the most. Listen. They tell you that emotional catharsis you can only get for both straight people and queer people with this unique thing of coming out, right? They tell us that that the only unique thing about the queer experience that will get views and get people to come to the movies is this thing of having this build up and this tension to, oh, is he going to tell them? Is he going to tell them? Oh, he just got kicked out. Oh, that's so upsetting, right? they tell you that that's what they want. They tell you that's what gets the most buy-in. They tell you sometimes it's straight people watching, sometimes it's queer people watching. What we tell you is that either way, any audience, that's ultimately harmful, right? Because it's not the same stories that we offer straight audiences. It's not the same stories that we afford to straight audiences. We don't give queer youth the privilege of getting to see joy. We don't give them the privilege of getting to see love. All we give them is, hey, you know how you go through this in your everyday life? Reflection. It's just implausible for the negating team to say that that's ever going to create better emotional outcomes for queer youth than our side would. In the case that we still have queer representation, but we do it in a way that prioritizes showing joy, that prioritizes showing progress, rather than the thing that you deal with in your everyday life, right? We think that they tell you at second that if you want a marriage film, that if you want a prom movie, you can just watch one of the many straight ones. And they use our mechanism of same love to say that there's no unique aspect of the queer experience that we can pull into a quick buck other than the coming out story. And I've just explained to you why that's incorrect. And as Kayla explains, it is extremely cathartic to see something plausible happen to you on TV. If you were a kid in a Catholic household, it is not plausible that one day you will be coming out to your parents. It is plausible that one day you'll be getting married to the love of your life. That's what we want queer kids to see. But on the straight audiences thing, right? I want to talk about, firstly, this narrative of straight people need to see the sort of struggles of queer experience. We tell you at Kayla that they have queer friends. We get this from the other side as well. But we also say that it's kind of unfair to posit that queer media should exist for straight people's education and straight people's education only, considering that straight people get to watch, rom-coms and comedies and fantasy thrillers all the time. And do you just not give queer people that privilege, right? We say, our counterfactual is that gay people get to choose what they want to watch rather than either being forced to watch a straight movie or just have to deal with confronting your religious trauma or seeing a false hope narrative of a coming out that goes well, right? We don't think it's fair to do that. We think we may not be the same, but that's not important. No freedom till we're equal.
Alright, I thank the speaker for their speech. I thank all speakers for this excellent debate. Congratulations for getting it through all day. I invite you guys to cross the floor, shake hands, ladies wave each other, and this could play out. And then we'll vacate the premises while the panel comes to their food.
Good job today.
Good job. That was really I'm actually really upset that Sandy wasn't in the room. Sorry, because you wanted to say we may not be the same.